I never thought that losing everything would lead me to finding the one thing I had been searching for my entire life. 3 months ago, I was Ahmed Hassan, a 28-year-old English teacher from Aleppo, living in the ruins of what used to be my childhood home. Today, I am sitting in a temporary housing center in Stockholm, staring at a man with the kindest blue eyes I have ever seen, wondering how someone can make you feel at home when you are thousands of miles away from everything you have ever known. His name is Erik Lindstrom, and he is a volunteer coordinator at the Rosengard Integration Center. He speaks Arabic with a Swedish accent that makes me smile despite myself, and he has this way of looking at you like you matter, like your story is worth hearing. When I first arrived at the center 6 weeks ago, exhausted and carrying nothing but a small backpack with my few remaining possessions, Erik was the first person to greet me. "Welcome to Sweden, Ahmed," he had said in careful Arabic, and something in his voice made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could actually be welcome somewhere again. The journey to Sweden had been a nightmare that I tried not to think about during the day and that haunted my dreams every night. 3 years of war had taken everything from me. My family, my home, my job, my sense of who I was supposed to be in the world. My younger brother Khalil had been killed in a bombing while he was walking to university. My parents had died when our apartment building was hit by artillery fire. I had survived because I was at school, teaching English to children who still believed that education could save them from the chaos surrounding us. After losing everyone I loved, I spent months moving from one destroyed neighborhood to another, trying to find some reason to keep going. The decision to leave Syria was not really a decision at all. It was survival. I had joined a group of refugees attempting to reach Europe through Turkey and Greece. The journey was dangerous, expensive, and heartbreaking. I saw people die at sea. I saw families separated at borders. I spent weeks in camps where hope seemed as scarce as clean water. But somehow, against all odds, I had made it to Sweden. And somehow, Erik Lindstrom had been there waiting for me with his gentle voice and his patient smile. The Rosengard Center was unlike anything I had expected. It was not just a place where refugees waited for paperwork to be processed. It was a community. Erik had created programs that brought Swedish volunteers together with newly arrived refugees for language exchange, cultural activities, and practical support. "You are not just waiting here," Erik explained to me during my first week. "You are building your new life one day at a time. We want to help you do that." The other refugees at the center came from all over the world. There was Farid from Afghanistan, who had been a doctor in Kabul and was studying to have his medical degree recognized in Sweden. There was Omar from Somalia, who spoke 5 languages and helped translate for newer arrivals. There was Dmitry from Ukraine, who had been a musician and was trying to find work with the Stockholm Philharmonic. Everyone had a story of loss, but also a story of resilience. Erik seemed to know all of their stories, to remember details about their lives that even close friends might forget. He remembered that Farid had a son who had stayed behind with relatives. He remembered that Omar missed playing football and had organized a weekly game in the nearby park. He remembered that Dmitry had not touched a piano since leaving his homeland and had quietly arranged for him to have access to a practice room at a local music school. And somehow, Erik seemed to remember everything about me too. He remembered that I had been a teacher and asked if I would be interested in helping other refugees with English lessons. He remembered that I mentioned missing Syrian food and brought me ingredients to make kibbeh in the center's communal kitchen. He remembered that I had trouble sleeping and suggested I try the reading room in the evenings when it was quieter. At first, I thought this was just how Erik treated everyone. I thought his kindness was professional, part of his job as a volunteer coordinator. But as weeks passed, I started to notice things that made me wonder if there was something more personal in the way he looked at me, the way he found excuses to check on how I was settling in, the way he lingered when we talked about books or music or what life had been like before the war. Erik was 26 years old, a graduate student in social work at Stockholm University who had started volunteering at the center 2 years earlier. He lived in a small apartment in Södermalm with his cat, Astrid, and spent most of his free time either at the center or studying. He spoke Arabic because he had spent a summer in Jordan during university, working with Palestinian refugees. He had grown up in a small town in northern Sweden, the son of a high school principal and a nurse. He had always felt different from his classmates, always felt like he was searching for something he could not name. When he started working with refugees, he said he finally found a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. But I suspected there was more to Eric's story than he usually shared. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with an expression that seemed almost longing. Sometimes when our hands accidentally touched while we were working on paperwork together, he would pull away quickly, as if the contact had startled him. Sometimes I thought I saw him watching me from across the room during community dinners, but when I looked back, he would be deep in conversation with someone else. I was not sure what to make of these moments. In Syria, I had always known I was different. I had never felt the way other men seemed to feel about women. I had never understood the pressure to get married and start a family. But in a conservative society, these feelings were something I kept buried deep inside myself. The war had made questions of love and attraction seem irrelevant anyway. Survival had been the only thing that mattered. But here in Sweden, surrounded by safety and possibility, I found myself thinking about things I had not allowed myself to consider in years. I found myself noticing the way Eric's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way his voice became softer when he spoke Arabic. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, to the moments when it was just the two of us going over integration paperwork or planning activities for other refugees. I found myself wondering what it would be like to know Eric outside of the center, to see his apartment, to meet his friends, to understand what his life looked like when he was not being professionally kind to people like me. The realization that I might be falling in love with Eric hit me like a physical blow. I was sitting in the center's small library one evening, trying to read a Swedish newspaper and struggling with the unfamiliar words, when Eric sat down across from me. "How are you doing with the language learning?" he asked in Arabic. "It is difficult," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I will never really understand this place, never really belong here." "You belong here, Ahmed." His voice was firm, certain. "I know it does not feel that way yet, but you belong here as much as anyone." The way he said it, the intensity in his blue eyes, made something flutter in my chest. For a moment, we just looked at each other, and I thought I saw something in his expression that matched what I was feeling. But then another refugee came into the library asking for help with a government form, and the moment passed. That night, I lay awake in my narrow bed in the shared room I had been assigned, thinking about Eric's words and the way he had looked at me. I thought about the possibility that maybe he felt something too, and the thought terrified and excited me in equal measure. What would it mean to fall in love here, in this new country, with someone who had shown me such kindness? Was it even possible for someone like Eric to care about someone like me? A refugee with no money, no status, no clear future? The next few weeks passed in a blur of language classes, integration workshops, and stolen moments of conversation with Eric. I was making progress with Swedish slowly but steadily. I had started helping other Arabic-speaking refugees with their paperwork and translation needs. I had even begun to make friends among the other residents at the center. But underneath all of this normal activity, I was increasingly aware of my feelings for Eric and increasingly confused about whether those feelings might be reciprocated. Eric seemed to find reasons to spend time with me. He would ask for my help organizing cultural events, claiming that my English teaching background made me good at explaining things clearly. He would invite me to join him for coffee after language classes, saying he wanted to practice his Arabic. He would walk with me to the grocery store, ostensibly to help me navigate Swedish product labels, but often ending up in long conversations about books, politics, or our different experiences growing up in Syria and Sweden. These interactions felt different from Eric's professional kindness toward other refugees. There was something more personal, more intimate in the way we talked to each other. But I was afraid to read too much into it. I was afraid that my own feelings were making me imagine something that was not really there. The turning point came during the center's monthly cultural celebration. Each month, residents from a different country would organize food, music, and presentations to share their culture with the Swedish volunteers and the broader community. November was Syria month, and I had volunteered to help coordinate the event. I spent weeks planning the menu, organizing traditional music, and preparing a presentation about Syrian history and culture. Eric helped with logistics, but he also spent hours listening to me talk about my homeland, asking thoughtful questions about everything from Syrian poetry to the architecture of Damascus. The night of the event, the center's main hall was transformed. We had hung Syrian flags and photographs of historic sites. Tables were loaded with kibbeh, tabbouleh, baklava, and other dishes that smelled like home. A Syrian musician who lived in Stockholm had agreed to perform traditional songs. I stood at the front of the room, looking out at an audience of refugees from many different countries and Swedish volunteers who had become friends. For the first time since arriving in Sweden, I felt proud instead of just grateful. I felt like I had something valuable to share instead of just needing help. I began my presentation by talking about Syria before the war. I showed pictures of Aleppo's ancient citadel, of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, of the markets and schools and neighborhoods where ordinary people had lived ordinary lives. I talked about Syrian contributions to literature, science, and art. I talked about the warmth and hospitality that had always defined Syrian culture. Then I talked about the war and what it had taken from us. I talked about losing my family, my home, my sense of who I was supposed to be. I talked about the refugee journey and the kindness I had found here in Sweden. As I spoke, I found myself looking at Eric, who was standing at the back of the room. His eyes never left my face, and I could see tears running down his cheeks. When I finished the presentation, the audience applauded loudly, but I barely heard them. All I could see was Eric, who was looking at me with an expression of such profound emotion that it took my breath away. After the formal program ended, people mingled, ate, and listened to music. I was surrounded by people congratulating me on the presentation, asking questions about Syria, and sharing their own stories. But I kept finding myself looking for Eric, wanting to talk to him about what I had seen in his face during my speech. I finally found him outside on the center's small patio, sitting alone on a bench and staring up at the November sky. The Stockholm winter was beginning, and the air was cold enough to see our breath. I sat down beside him, and for a long moment we did not speak. "Your presentation was beautiful, Ahmed." He spoke quietly, still looking up at the stars. "Thank you for sharing your story with all of us." "Thank you for listening," I replied. "It meant a lot to me to see you there, to know that you cared about understanding where I come from." Eric turned to look at me then, and in the dim light from the patio lamp, I could see that his eyes were still bright with unshed tears. "I do care, Ahmed. I care more than I should probably admit." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean?" He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I mean that somewhere along the way, helping you settle in Sweden stopped being just my job. I mean that I look forward to seeing you every day. I mean that I think about you when I am at home, when I am studying, when I am trying to fall asleep at night." I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. Eric continued, the words coming faster now, as if he had been holding them back for weeks. "I mean that I have never felt this way about anyone before, and it scares me because I do not want to take advantage of the fact that you are in a vulnerable position. I do not want you to feel like you owe me anything or like your status here depends on how you respond to me." "Eric," I said softly, and he looked up at me with such hope and fear in his eyes that I thought my heart might break. "You are not taking advantage of anything. You have never made me feel like I owed you anything. Everything you have done for me, every kindness you have shown, it has all been a gift. And if I am being honest, the reason I look forward to seeing you every day has nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the fact that I think I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the cold air between us. Eric's eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. But then he smiled, and it was like the sun coming up after the longest night of winter. "Really?" he asked, and his voice was full of wonder. "Really?" I confirmed. "Even though I have no idea what I am doing or what this means or how any of this is supposed to work." Eric laughed, and the sound was pure joy. "I do not know what I am doing either, Ahmed, but I know that I want to figure it out with you." When he kissed me, it was soft and tentative and perfect. It tasted like possibility and hope and the promise of something beautiful growing between us. When we broke apart, we were both smiling and shivering in the cold Swedish air. "We should go inside before we freeze," Eric said, but neither of us moved. "I want to do this right, Ahmed. I want to take you on proper dates. I want you to meet my friends. I want to cook dinner for you in my apartment. I want all of this to be real and normal and good. I want that too, I said. But Eric, you need to understand something. I have never done this before. In Syria, feelings like this, relationships like this, they were not possible. I do not know how to be someone's boyfriend. I do not even know if that is the right word for what we might be to each other. We will figure it out, Eric said simply. Together. We will figure all of it out together. The next few weeks were a careful dance of getting to know each other outside of the refugee center context. Eric was right about wanting to do things properly. He asked me on official dates, planned activities that had nothing to do with integration services or volunteer work. Our first real date was to the Vasa Museum, where we spent hours looking at the preserved 17th century warship and talking about history, exploration, and what it meant to find yourself in a completely different world than the one you had been born into. Our second date was to a concert at Stockholm Concert Hall, where we listened to Beethoven and I watched Eric's face more than I watched the musicians on stage. Our third date was dinner at Eric's apartment, where I met Astrid the cat and Eric cooked Swedish meatballs while I told him about the spices my mother had used in her cooking. The apartment was small but warm, filled with books in Swedish and Arabic, photographs from Eric's travels, and plants that somehow thrived despite the limited winter sunlight. After dinner, we sat on Eric's couch, and he showed me photo albums from his childhood in northern Sweden. Pictures of him as a serious-looking child with white blonde hair, of family vacations to the mountains, of graduations and birthdays and ordinary moments that suddenly seemed precious because they were part of the story of who Eric had become. I told him about my own childhood in Aleppo, about my brother Khalil who had wanted to be an engineer, about my parents who had been so proud when I became a teacher. I told him about the things I missed most about Syria, the call to prayer echoing across the city at sunset, the smell of jasmine in my grandmother's garden, the way the light looked different in the desert. But I also told him about the things I was discovering I loved about Sweden. The way the snow made everything look clean and new, the long summer days he had promised to show me, the sense that here I could become whoever I wanted to be without the weight of other people's expectations. That night, Eric walked me back to the center, and we stood outside in the snow, reluctant to say goodbye. I wish you did not have to go back there, he said quietly. I wish you could just stay with me. Soon, I said, though I was not sure when or how that might be possible. My legal status in Sweden was still uncertain. I was waiting for a decision on my asylum application, living week to week on temporary permits and the charity of the integration center. Eric and I both knew that my situation was precarious, that there were no guarantees about my future in Sweden. But we also knew that what was growing between us was real and worth fighting for. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of my life, despite the uncertainty about my legal status. Eric and I settled into a routine of spending time together several evenings a week and most weekends. Sometimes we went out to explore Stockholm, visiting museums, trying new restaurants, or just walking through the old town and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes we stayed in Eric's apartment, cooking together, reading, or watching Swedish films with Arabic subtitles so I could practice the language. Sometimes we went to events at the refugee center together, but now as a couple rather than as a volunteer and a client. The other refugees at the center had noticed the change in our relationship, and their reactions varied. Some, like Farid and Omar, were genuinely happy for us and treated Eric as part of our extended family. Others were more skeptical, worried that I was making my situation more complicated or that Eric might not have the best intentions. I understand their concerns, I told Eric one evening as we walked home from a community dinner where some of the other residents had been less than welcoming. They are trying to protect me, and they have seen situations where refugees were taken advantage of by people who claim to be helping them. I get it, Eric replied, and I want them to trust me, but I understand that trust has to be earned. I just hope they can see that what I feel for you is real, that this is not some kind of charity project or savior complex. I know it is real, I assured him, and eventually they will see that too. The test of that came sooner than either of us expected. In early December, I received a letter from the Swedish Migration Agency. My asylum application had been denied. I had 2 weeks to appeal the decision or face deportation back to Syria. I was sitting in the center's main office when I opened the letter, and the shock of reading the denial was so intense that I felt physically sick. Eric was working at his desk nearby, and when he saw my expression, he immediately came over to see what was wrong. When I showed him the letter, his face went white. "This is wrong," he said immediately. "Your case should be clear-cut. Syria is a war zone. You lost your entire family. You have documentation proving your identity and your circumstances. How could they possibly deny your application?" "I do not know," I said, and my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "Maybe there were mistakes in my paperwork. Maybe they do not believe my story. Maybe they just have too many applications and are looking for reasons to reject people." Eric was already reaching for his phone. "I am calling my supervisor at the university. She has connections with immigration lawyers. We are going to appeal this decision, and we are going to win." "But what if we do not win?" I asked. "What if in 2 weeks I have to leave Sweden? What happens to us then?" Eric sat down beside me and took my hands in his. "Ahmed, look at me. We are not going to let that happen. I will do everything in my power to help you stay here. And if somehow the worst happens, if somehow you have to leave, then I will find a way to be with you wherever you go." "You cannot do that," I protested. "You have your whole life here, your studies, your family, your future. You cannot throw all of that away for someone you have known for only a few months." "I am not throwing anything away," Eric said firmly. "Ahmed, I love you. I am in love with you. What we have together is not something I am willing to give up without a fight." The words hit me like lightning. It was the first time either of us had said those words out loud, and hearing them in the middle of this crisis made them feel both more precious and more fragile. "I love you too," I whispered. "But Eric, I am so scared. What if loving each other is not enough? What if all the legal documents and bureaucracy and politics are stronger than what we feel? Then we will prove them wrong," Eric said simply. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Eric's supervisor connected us with an immigration lawyer who specialized in asylum cases. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ingrid Svensson, reviewed my file and immediately identified several procedural errors in how my case had been handled. "Your initial interview was conducted by someone who was not properly trained in Syrian conflict documentation," she explained during our first meeting. "Several key pieces of evidence were not properly considered. This denial is absolutely grounds for appeal, and I believe we have a strong chance of success." But strong chance was not the same as certainty, and I spent those 2 weeks oscillating between hope and despair. Eric was amazing throughout the entire process. He helped me gather additional documentation, drove me to appointments with the lawyer, and spent hours helping me prepare for the appeal interview. More than that, he was simply present. When I could not sleep because of anxiety, he stayed up with me, reading aloud from books or just holding me until the panic passed. When I could not eat because my stomach was twisted with worry, he made simple foods that reminded me of home and sat with me until I managed a few bites. When I was convinced that I was going to be deported and that our relationship was doomed, he reminded me of all the reasons we had to be optimistic. The other refugees at the center rallied around us as well. Farid helped me organize additional character references. Omar connected me with other Syrians in Stockholm who had successfully appealed similar decisions. Dmitry wrote a letter to the immigration authorities about my contributions to the center's community programs. Even the residents who had initially been skeptical of my relationship with Eric seemed to understand that we were fighting for something larger than just our personal happiness. We were fighting for the principle that love could transcend borders, that refugees deserved the same chances at happiness as anyone else, that Sweden's promises of sanctuary should be honored. The appeal hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in mid-December. Eric had arranged to take the day off from his studies to come with me for moral support. We sat in the waiting area of the immigration office, holding hands and barely speaking, both of us too nervous to make conversation. When my name was called, I felt like I was walking to my own execution. The hearing officer was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who asked me to retell my story from the beginning. I talked about my life in Aleppo before the war, about losing my family, about the decision to leave Syria. I talked about the journey to Sweden and what integration had meant to me. I talked about the community I had found at the refugee center, about the Swedish language classes, about my hopes for contributing to Swedish society. And then, because it felt important and because I was tired of being afraid, I talked about Eric. I talked about finding love in a place where I had expected only charity. I talked about how Eric had helped me understand that belonging somewhere was not just about legal documents but about building relationships and finding people who valued you for who you were. The hearing officer listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. When I finished speaking, he reviewed my file quietly for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. "Mr. Hassan," he said finally, "I want to apologize for the errors in your initial application review. Your case should have been approved months ago. Based on the evidence presented and your testimony today, I am overturning the previous denial. Your asylum application is approved. You will receive legal residency status in Sweden, with a pathway to permanent residency and eventual citizenship." I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. "You mean I can stay?" "You can stay," he confirmed. "Welcome to Sweden, Mr. Hassan." I walked out of that office in a daze. Eric was waiting in the hallway, and when he saw my expression, he immediately stood up. "Well," he asked, and his voice was tight with anxiety. "I can stay," I said, and then louder, "I can stay, Eric." Eric swept me into his arms right there in the government building, spinning me around and laughing with relief and joy. Other people in the hallway were staring at us, but neither of us cared. "I can stay," I kept repeating, as if saying it would make it more real. That night, we celebrated at Eric's apartment with takeout from my favorite Middle Eastern restaurant and a bottle of champagne that Eric had been saving for this exact occasion. We called my lawyer to thank her. We called Eric's parents to share the good news. We video called the other refugees at the center, who cheered and applauded when they heard about the successful appeal. But mostly, we just sat together on Eric's couch, holding each other and marveling at the fact that we no longer had to worry about our time together being cut short. "Now we can really plan a future," Eric said, his arms around me as we watched the snow fall outside his apartment window. "Now we can think about next year and the year after that and all the years we want to spend together. What do you want our future to look like?" I asked him. Eric was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want us to live together officially. I want to introduce you to my parents as my boyfriend, not just as a refugee I am helping. I want to travel with you, maybe go back to Jordan where I first fell in love with Arabic culture, maybe visit other places we have both dreamed of seeing. I want to watch you become a teacher again here in Sweden when you are ready. I want us to build something together that is ours. What do you want, Ahmed?" I thought about his question seriously. I want all of those things too, but mostly, I want to stop feeling like I am just surviving and start feeling like I am living. For 3 years, everything has been about getting through one more day, making it to safety, figuring out how to exist in a world that seemed determined to reject me. With you, I feel like I can finally think about what it means to be happy instead of just grateful to be alive. Eric kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise. "You make me happy too, Ahmed. Happier than I ever thought I could be." The months that followed were about building the life we had imagined together. In January, I moved out of the refugee center and into Eric's apartment. It was a big adjustment, learning to share space with someone, learning the rhythms of domestic life together. Eric was neat and organized in a very Swedish way, while I was more comfortable with a certain amount of chaos. He liked to plan meals in advance, while I preferred to cook based on whatever looked good at the market. He went to bed early and woke up early, while I was naturally a night owl who liked to stay up reading or talking. But we figured out compromises, and more importantly, we learned that these small differences were part of what made living together interesting rather than problems to be solved. I started taking more advanced Swedish classes and began the process of having my Syrian teaching credentials evaluated for recognition in Sweden. It would take time and additional coursework, but the prospect of returning to teaching filled me with excitement I had not felt in years. Eric was finishing his master's degree in social work and starting to think about job opportunities that would let him continue working with refugee communities. We talked about maybe opening a community center together someday, a place that would provide both practical support and cultural programming for immigrants and refugees. In March, Eric took me to meet his parents in his hometown in northern Sweden. I was nervous about the visit, unsure of how they would react to their son's Syrian refugee boyfriend, but Eric's parents, Lars and Margarita, welcomed me with the same quiet warmth that had first drawn me to Eric. They asked thoughtful questions about Syria and my experiences as a refugee, but they also asked about my favorite books, my thoughts on Swedish politics, and whether I preferred cross-country skiing or downhill skiing now that I was learning winter sports. They treated me like a normal part of their son's life rather than as an exotic curiosity, and by the end of the weekend, I felt like I had gained not just a boyfriend but a family. In May, as Stockholm's long winter finally gave way to spring, Eric and I took our first real vacation together. We went to the west coast of Sweden, to a small fishing village where Eric had spent summers as a child. We rented a tiny cottage by the water and spent a week walking along rocky beaches, eating fresh seafood, and talking about our dreams for the future. One evening, as we watched the sunset over the North Sea, Eric turned to me with a serious expression. "Ahmed, I have been thinking about something for a while, and I want to talk to you about it." "What is it?" I asked, though something in his tone made me think this was a conversation that would be important. "I want us to get married," he said simply. "Not right away, not until you feel ready, but someday. I want to make this official. I want the legal protections that come with marriage, especially given your immigration status. But more than that, I want the world to know that we are committed to each other, that this is not just a relationship but a partnership, a family." I stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Marriage had not been something I had allowed myself to think about. In Syria, marriage between two men was not legally possible and was socially unthinkable. Even here in Sweden, where same-sex marriage was legal, the idea felt almost too enormous to contemplate. "Are you sure?" I asked finally. "Are you sure this is what you want? Not just now, while everything feels new and exciting, but for the long term? Are you sure you want to tie your life to mine when I am still figuring out who I am supposed to be in this country?" Eric reached for my hands, holding them gently as he spoke. "Ahmed, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are not a burden or a responsibility or a charity case. You are the person I want to build a life with. You are the person I want to grow old with. You are my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. If you will have me, I want to be your husband." The tears that came then were not tears of sadness or fear, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and joy. "Yes," I said through my tears. "Yes, Eric. I want that too. I want all of it. I want to be your husband and I want you to be mine." When Eric kissed me there on the beach in western Sweden, with the sun setting over the water and seabirds calling in the distance, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. I had spent so many years feeling displaced, feeling like I did not belong anywhere or with anyone. But in Eric's arms, I finally understood what home really meant. It was not a place or a building or even a country. It was the person who saw you for who you really were and loved you not despite your flaws and your history and your complicated story, but because of all of those things. It was the person who made you feel like you deserved happiness, like you deserved love, like you deserved a future full of possibility. We got engaged officially 6 months later, with a simple ceremony at the refugee center where we had first met. All of our friends from the center were there, along with Eric's parents and some of his university classmates. Farid gave a speech about love transcending borders. Omar organized traditional music from several different cultures. Dmitri played piano while we exchanged rings that we had chosen together, simple silver bands engraved with words in both Arabic and Swedish. But the moment that meant the most to me was when Eric's father pulled me aside after the ceremony. "Ahmed," he said in his careful English, "I want you to know that you are not just marrying our son. You are becoming our son too. You are part of our family now, and we are honored to have you." The wedding itself was planned for the following spring, which would mark exactly 2 years since I had first arrived in Sweden. We wanted to have time to do it right, to plan a celebration that honored both of our cultures and included all of the people who had supported us along the way. As I write this, sitting in the apartment that Eric and I now share, planning guest lists and thinking about vows, I am struck by how impossible this happiness would have seemed just 2 years ago. When I was fleeing Syria, when I was crowded into refugee camps, when I was crossing dangerous borders with nothing but hope and desperation, I could never have imagined that I would end up here. Not just in Sweden, not just safe and legal and secure, but loved. Truly, deeply, unconditionally loved by someone who sees all of me, the broken parts and the healing parts and the parts that are still figuring out how to exist in this new world. Eric is in the kitchen now, making dinner and humming Swedish folk songs while Astrid the cat whines around his ankles. In a few minutes, he will call me to help set the table, and we will eat together and talk about our days and maybe watch a movie or read or just sit quietly together, comfortable in each other's presence. It is ordinary and domestic and everything I never knew I wanted. Tomorrow, I start a new job as a teaching assistant at a Stockholm elementary school, working with immigrant and refugee children who are learning Swedish as a second language. It is not exactly the same as the teaching I did in Syria, but it feels like a way to use my experience to help other people who are navigating the same challenges I faced when I first arrived. Eric finished his master's degree and got a job with the city's integration services, developing programs to help refugees find employment and housing. We work in related fields now, both of us committed to helping people who are trying to build new lives in Sweden. In some ways, our love story has become bigger than just the two of us. We have become advocates for refugee rights, for LGBTQ equality, for the idea that love and family can take many different forms. We speak at conferences sometimes, sharing our story with social workers and policymakers and anyone who wants to understand what integration really looks like when it works well. But at the end of the day, we come home to each other, and the big political implications fade away. What matters is that Eric still makes me laugh every day. What matters is that I still feel grateful every morning when I wake up next to him. What matters is that we have built something together that feels strong enough to weather whatever challenges might come our way. I know that our story is not over. There will be difficulties ahead. There will be moments when the differences in our backgrounds create misunderstandings. There will be challenges related to my continued integration into Swedish society, to our different relationships with our families of origin, to the ways that trauma and displacement continue to affect me even as I heal. But I also know that we will face those challenges together. I know that the love we have found is real and strong and worth protecting. I know that the life we are building together is based on mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to supporting each other's growth and happiness. Most importantly, I know that I am no longer just surviving. I am living fully and joyfully, in a way that honors both where I came from and where I am going. And I am doing it all with the man I love by my side, the man who saw me when I felt invisible, who believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself, who taught me that home is not a place you find but a life you build with the people who matter most. In a few months, Eric and I will stand in front of our friends and family and promise to love each other for the rest of our lives. We will exchange vows in Arabic and Swedish, acknowledging both of our cultures and the new culture we are creating together. We will dance to music from Syria and Sweden and all the other countries represented by our refugee center family. We will eat food that represents the fusion of our different backgrounds and the new traditions we are establishing as a couple. And then we will begin the next chapter of our story together, whatever that might bring. But for now, I can hear Eric calling me to dinner, and I can smell the cardamom and cinnamon he has learned to use in his cooking because he knows those spices remind me of home. For now, it is enough to be here, in this moment, in this apartment, in this country that has become home, with this man who has become my family. For now, it is enough to be loved and to love in return, to have found each other across all the distances and differences that could have kept us apart. This is our story, Eric's and mine, and it is still being written. But I know now how it ends, not with the specific details of what our future will hold, but with the certainty that whatever comes next, we will face it together. We will continue to build a life based on love, respect, understanding, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves the chance to find happiness, to find home, to find the person who makes them feel like they belong in the world. And maybe, if we are very lucky, our story will inspire other people who feel displaced or different or impossible to love to believe that their happy ending is possible too. Maybe it will help create a world where love truly does transcend borders, where refugees are seen as people with rich inner lives rather than just problems to be solved, where families come in all different forms and all of them are celebrated. That would be the best possible ending to our story. Not just our own happiness, but contributing to a world where more people can find the kind of love and acceptance and sense of belonging that Eric and I have found with each other. For now, though, dinner is ready, and the man I love is waiting for me in the kitchen. And this ordinary Tuesday evening in Stockholm feels like the most extraordinary gift I could ever have imagined receiving. This is what love looks like. Not just the dramatic moments of crisis and rescue, but the quiet daily choice to build a life together. One meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one shared dream at a time. And I am grateful, so grateful, for all of it. But life, as I was learning, has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. Just when everything seemed perfect, when our future together felt secure and bright, we faced our first real crisis as a couple. It started with a phone call that came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in February. I was sleeping deeply when Eric's phone rang, and I felt him jolt awake beside me. Phone calls at that hour were never good news. Eric answered groggily, speaking in rapid Swedish that I could not follow in my half-awake state. But I could hear the tension in his voice, the way it changed from confused to shocked to deeply concerned. "Ahmed," Eric said after hanging up, and his voice was shaking. "That was my father. My mother is in the hospital. She had a heart attack. They do not know if she is going to make it." I was fully awake now, sitting up and reaching for Eric's hand in the darkness. "Oh my God, Eric, what do we need to do?" "I have to go home," he said, already getting out of bed and moving toward the closet to pack. "The next train to Umeå leaves in 2 hours. I can be there by this afternoon." "Of course," I said. "Do you want me to come with you?" He paused in his packing, looking at me with an expression I could not read. "Ahmed, I appreciate the offer, but I think I should go alone. This is a family crisis, and my parents are going to be dealing with a lot. Adding the complexity of introducing you to my extended family right now, when everyone is stressed and scared, might not be the best idea." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I tried to keep my voice neutral. "I understand. You need to be with your family right now. But Eric, I am your family too. We are engaged. We are building a life together. I know, and I love you for wanting to support me. But my aunts and uncles and cousins, they do not know about you yet. My parents have not had time to prepare them. It would just be one more thing for everyone to process when all of our energy needs to be focused on my mother's recovery." I watched Eric pack his bag in the dim light from the bedside lamp, and I felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. This was the moment I had been dreading without realizing it. The moment when Eric's two worlds, his Swedish family world and his life with me, would collide and I would discover which one was more important to him. "I will call you every day," Eric promised as he kissed me goodbye at the door. "This is not about us, Ahmed. This is just about timing and circumstances. I will be back as soon as I can. I love you." "I love you too," I replied, but the words felt hollow. After Eric left, I sat in our apartment feeling more alone than I had since my first weeks in Sweden. Astrid seemed to sense my distress and curled up next to me on the couch, purring softly. But even her comfort could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Eric. The next few days passed in a blur of work and worry. Eric called every evening to update me on his mother's condition. She was stable but still in intensive care. The doctors were cautiously optimistic but could not make any promises about her recovery. Eric's extended family had descended on Umeå from all over northern Sweden, and he was helping coordinate visitors, manage his father's emotional state, and handle the practical details of his mother's care. I tried to be supportive during our phone calls, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being kept at arm's length. When I suggested taking time off work to come be with him, Eric gently discouraged me. When I offered to help coordinate things from Stockholm, he said his family had everything under control. When I asked about his mother's prognosis, he gave me medical updates but did not share his fears or feelings the way he usually did. By the end of the first week, I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own relationship. The man who had once shared every thought and feeling with me was now having the most important emotional experience of his life, and I was completely shut out of it. "Ahmed," Fard said to me one evening when I was helping serve dinner at the refugee center, "You look terrible. What is wrong?" I explained the situation with Eric's mother and my feelings of exclusion. Fard listened thoughtfully, then shook his head. "My friend, I think you are making this too much about yourself. The man's mother is dying. Of course, he is not thinking clearly about everything else in his life right now. But it is not about clear thinking, I protested. It is about whether he sees me as part of his family or as something separate from his real life. When crisis happens, when everything is on the line, that is when you find out what people really value. And right now, Eric is showing me that I am not part of his inner circle. I am just someone he happens to be dating. Farid sighed. Ahmed, you are letting your old fears take over. You are acting like that scared refugee who thought he did not deserve love. But you are not that person anymore. You are Eric's partner, his fiancé. He chose you. He has proven his commitment to you over and over again. Do not let one difficult situation undo everything you have built together. Maybe Farid was right, but I could not shake my doubts. The longer Eric stayed in Umrah, the more distant he seemed to become from our life together in Stockholm. Our phone calls grew shorter and less frequent. When I asked when he might be coming back, he said he did not know. When I asked about our wedding planning, he said he could not think about that right now. 2 weeks after Eric had left, I was at my lowest point. I had barely slept, I was not eating properly, and I was starting to question everything about our relationship. That was when Omar found me crying in the refugee center's library late one evening. "Brother, what is happening to you?" Omar asked, sitting down beside me. "You look like you did when you first arrived here, all fear and sadness." I told Omar about Eric's mother and my feelings of abandonment. I told him about my growing conviction that Eric was using this crisis as an excuse to pull away from our relationship. I told him about the voice in my head that kept saying that this was always going to happen, that someone like Eric would eventually realize that he had made a mistake getting involved with someone like me. Omar listened without interruption, then was quiet for a long moment. "Ahmed," he said finally, "I am going to tell you something that might be hard to hear, but I think you need to hear it. You are being selfish." "No, wait," Omar continued when I started to protest. "Let me finish. I understand why you are being selfish. You have been abandoned by everyone you loved. You have learned to expect the worst from people. But Eric is not your family in Syria. He is not the people who failed to protect you during the war. He is not the immigration officials who tried to send you back to a country where you would have died. He is the man who loves you, who has proven his love over and over again. And right now, his mother is dying, and instead of supporting him through the hardest time in his life, you are making it about your own insecurities." Omar's words stung because they were true. I had been so focused on my own fears that I had lost sight of what Eric was actually going through. His mother, the woman who had raised him, who had welcomed me into their family, was fighting for her life. And instead of being his partner and support system, I had been keeping score and nursing grievances. "I need to go to him," I said suddenly. "I need to be there for him, whether his extended family is ready to meet me or not." "Now you are talking sense," Omar said, smiling for the first time during our conversation. I booked a train ticket to Umrah for the next morning and called Eric to tell him I was coming. "Ahmed, I do not think this is a good time," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Eric," I said firmly, "your mother is in the hospital. You are scared and exhausted and dealing with one of the most difficult situations of your life. I am your partner. I am supposed to be there for you during times like this. If your family is not ready to meet me, then they will just have to adjust. But if I do not come now, if I let you face this alone, then what is the point of being engaged? What is the point of promising to be there for each other through sickness and health if the first time you get sick, I stay home because it might be awkward?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Eric said quietly, "I have been so scared, Ahmed. I have been so scared that she is going to die, and I have been trying to hold everything together for my father and for everyone else. I have not let myself feel how terrified I am." "I know," I said, "and you do not have to hold everything together by yourself. That is what I am here for. Let me help you carry this." When I arrived in Umrah the next afternoon, Eric met me at the train station. He looked exhausted, thinner than when he had left Stockholm, with stress lines around his eyes that I had never seen before. But when he saw me, his whole body seemed to relax. He wrapped his arms around me right there on the platform, and I felt him start to cry against my shoulder. "I am so glad you came," he whispered. "I needed you here, but I was too scared to ask." We drove to the hospital together, Eric's hand in mine as he told me about his mother's condition. She had stabilized somewhat, but the doctors were still concerned about her heart function. She was awake and alert, but weak. The whole family was taking turns staying with her so she would not be alone. When we walked into the hospital room, I saw Eric's father, Lars, sitting beside the bed holding his wife's hand. Margarita looked pale and fragile, connected to various monitors and machines, but her eyes were bright when she saw Eric. And then she saw me behind him, and her face lit up with genuine joy. "Ahmed," she said, her voice weak but warm. "You came." Eric said you might not be able to make it. "I would not miss this," I said, moving to the other side of her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I have been hit by a truck," she said with a slight smile. "But better now that you are both here." "Eric told me you have been worried about me." "We have been worried about you," I corrected. "We love you, and we want you to get better." Over the next few hours, Eric's extended family began arriving for evening visiting hours. I met aunts and uncles and cousins, all of whom were clearly curious about me but trying to be polite given the circumstances. Some of them had obviously been briefed about who I was, while others seemed surprised to discover that Eric had a Syrian fiancée. But what struck me most was how naturally Eric included me in everything. He introduced me as his partner, his fiancé, the man he was going to marry. He asked for my opinion about his mother's care. He made sure I was included in family discussions about visiting schedules and meal coordination. This was not the Eric who had been keeping me at arm's length over the phone. This was the Eric I knew and loved, who saw me as an integral part of his life. After visiting hours ended, we went back to Eric's childhood home, where his father was staying. The house was full of relatives who had come to provide support, and Eric and I were given his old bedroom to share. As we got ready for bed, Eric finally explained what had been happening during those difficult weeks. "Ahmed, I owe you an apology," he said as we lay in his narrow childhood bed. "I have been handling this all wrong. I was so overwhelmed by the medical crisis and by managing everyone else's emotions that I convinced myself I was protecting you by keeping you away. But really, I was protecting myself. I was scared that if you saw me completely falling apart, if you saw how much I needed you, you might realize that I am not as strong as you think I am. That maybe you made a mistake choosing me." "Eric," I said, turning to face him in the darkness, "I did not fall in love with you because I thought you were perfect. I fell in love with you because you are real, because you let me see your vulnerabilities and your fears and your humanity. If you think I am going to love you less because you need comfort during the worst time of your life, then you do not understand what love is. Love is not about being strong all the time. It is about being strong for each other when the other person cannot be strong." That night, Eric cried in my arms for the first time since we had been together. He cried for his fear of losing his mother, for the stress of trying to hold his family together, for the weeks of isolation he had put himself through. And I held him and let him grieve and promised him that he would never have to face anything alone again. The next morning, something had shifted between us. Eric seemed more like himself, more present and connected. We spent the day at the hospital together, and I watched him interact with his mother with the tenderness and humor that had made me fall in love with him. Margarita was feeling stronger, and she insisted on hearing all about our wedding plans. She had opinions about flowers and music and whether we should have the ceremony in Stockholm or in Umeå. She made me promise to bring her fabric samples for the tablecloths she wanted to make as her contribution to the celebration. Eric's family embraced me in ways I had not expected. His aunts asked about my cooking and insisted I teach them how to make Syrian desserts. His uncles wanted to know about my work with immigrant children and shared stories about their own experiences with newcomers to their small northern communities. His cousins, many of whom were around our age, treated me like they had known me for years, including me in their jokes and asking about my impressions of Swedish culture. By the end of the weekend, I felt like I had gained not just a partner but an entire extended family. When Margarita was discharged from the hospital a week later, Eric and I stayed in Umeå for a few more days to help her get settled at home. She was going to need months of cardiac rehabilitation, but her prognosis was good. The crisis had passed, and she was going to recover fully. On our last evening in Umeå, Margarita pulled me aside for a private conversation. Ahmed, she said, I want to thank you for coming here, for being here for Eric. I know it was not easy, and I know my son did not handle things well at first. But seeing you two together, seeing how you take care of each other, it makes me so happy. Eric has never been happier than he has been since he met you. And you, she continued, you have found your place in our family. You belong here with us with Eric. Do not ever doubt that. Her words meant more to me than I could express. This woman who had been fighting for her life had taken the time to make sure I knew I was valued and wanted. The train ride back to Stockholm was different from the one I had taken to Umeå. Eric and I sat close together, his head on my shoulder, talking quietly about everything that had happened. I learned that he had been just as scared as I was, just as worried about whether our relationship was strong enough to survive real adversity. But we had survived it. We had found our way back to each other, and we were stronger for having gone through it together. I am sorry I shut you out, Eric said as we watched the Swedish countryside pass by the train window. I am sorry I made you feel like you were not part of my family. You were dealing with an impossible situation, I replied. And I am sorry I made it harder by letting my insecurities take over instead of just being there for you. We both learned something important, though. We learned that we are stronger together than we are apart. The experience with Eric's mother's illness became a turning point in our relationship. We had faced our first real test as a couple, and we had come through it with a deeper understanding of each other and a stronger commitment to our future together. The wedding planning resumed with new energy. Margarita, despite her doctor's orders to rest, became our most enthusiastic collaborator. She video called us weekly to discuss details, sent care packages with homemade preserves and knitted items for our future home, and made it clear that she expected to be heavily involved in every aspect of the celebration. We decided to have the wedding in Stockholm, but to incorporate elements that would honor Eric's northern Swedish heritage as well as my Syrian background. We found a venue that could accommodate both traditional Swedish and Middle Eastern music. We planned a menu that would include both Swedish and Syrian dishes. We designed invitations in Arabic, Swedish, and English to ensure that all of our guests would feel included. The guest list was an interesting mix of refugees from the center, Eric's university friends, his family from northern Sweden, and social workers and activists from both of our professional networks. We had people coming from all over Europe and the Middle East, creating a celebration that truly reflected the international community we had become part of. As the wedding date approached, I found myself thinking about how impossible this celebration would have seemed just 3 years earlier. When I was fleeing Syria, when I was living in refugee camps, when I was sitting in immigration offices waiting to learn if I would be allowed to stay in Sweden, I could never have imagined that I would be planning a wedding that would bring together people from so many different backgrounds to celebrate love and commitment. The night before the wedding, Eric and I had dinner with our wedding party at a small restaurant in Gamla stan, Stockholm's old town. Our wedding party was unconventional. Farid and Omar from the refugee center were my groomsmen, while Eric's university friends Marcus and Johan were his. But what made the evening special was not the formal roles but the genuine affection and support that everyone showed for our relationship. These were the people who had witnessed our love story from the beginning, who had supported us through the challenges, and who were genuinely excited to celebrate our commitment to each other. The wedding day itself was perfect in ways I had not dared to hope for. The weather was warm and sunny, unusual for March in Stockholm. The venue was decorated with flowers that incorporated both Swedish and Syrian traditions. White roses and baby's breath mixed with jasmine and orange blossoms. When I saw Eric waiting for me at the altar, wearing a traditional Swedish folk costume that had belonged to his grandfather, I felt my heart stop. He looked nervous and excited and more handsome than I had ever seen him. When he saw me walking down the aisle, wearing a Syrian wedding robe that one of the other refugees had helped me acquire, his face lit up with joy and love. We had written our vows together, incorporating promises in both Arabic and Swedish. Eric promised to be my partner in building a life that honored both of our cultures. I promised to be his companion in creating a family that was based on love rather than blood, on choice rather than circumstance. We promised to support each other's dreams, to comfort each other during difficult times, and to never take for granted the miracle of having found each other. When the officiant pronounced us married, The celebration that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Eric's northern Swedish relatives danced with Syrian refugees. University students from Stockholm shared stories with elderly Somali women. The music moved seamlessly from traditional Swedish folk songs to Arabic wedding music to contemporary pop songs that everyone could sing along with. But the moment that meant the most to me was when Margarita, who had insisted on traveling to Stockholm despite her recent health scare, pulled me aside during the reception. "Ahmed," she said, tears in her eyes, "I am so proud to call you my son. Welcome to our family, officially and forever." The honeymoon was a week in Jordan, the country where Eric had first fallen in love with Arabic culture and where we could both experience the Middle East together as a married couple. It was my first time back in the Arab world since leaving Syria, and I was surprised by how emotional the experience was. Hearing Arabic spoken everywhere, smelling familiar spices in the markets, seeing architecture that reminded me of home, all of it brought back memories of my life before the war. But this time, I was not alone with those memories. Eric was there to share them with me, to ask questions about my reactions, to hold me when the grief hit unexpectedly. And I was there to show him the culture I came from, to translate not just the language but the customs and the ways of thinking that had shaped who I was. We visited Petra and Wadi Rum, swam in the Dead Sea, and spent hours wandering through the souks of Amman. But we also spent time with Palestinian refugees living in Jordan, people whose stories reminded us both of the ongoing displacement and suffering in the region. It was a honeymoon that was both romantic and educational, both personally meaningful and politically conscious. When we returned to Stockholm, we moved into a larger apartment in Södermalm, a neighborhood known for its diversity and its young, progressive residents. We had 2 bedrooms now, one for us and one that we planned to use as a home office and guest room for when family visited. We had a kitchen large enough for both of us to cook in comfortably, and a living room where we could entertain the growing circle of friends and colleagues who had become our chosen family. Eric had been offered a permanent position with Stockholm's Refugee Services, developing programs to help newly arrived immigrants find employment. I had been accepted into a master's program in education, with a focus on multicultural pedagogy and working with immigrant children. We were both building careers that felt meaningful, that used our experiences and our skills to help other people navigate the challenges we had faced ourselves. But more than that, we were building a life together that felt authentic and sustainable. We had learned to navigate the small differences in our backgrounds and personalities. We had created traditions that honored both of our cultures while also establishing new customs that were uniquely ours. We had weathered our first major crisis as a couple and emerged stronger and more committed. We had surrounded ourselves with people who supported our relationship and who shared our values of inclusivity and social justice. As I write this, 6 months after our wedding, I am sitting in our new apartment on a Sunday morning, watching Eric make pancakes while listening to Swedish folk music. It is a scene of domestic contentment that I could never have imagined during my darkest days as a refugee. But it is also more than that. It is the life we have built together, consciously and deliberately, based on mutual respect and shared dreams. It is the result of hundreds of small choices to trust each other, to be vulnerable with each other, to prioritize our relationship even when it was difficult or scary. This morning, Eric and I are planning our next adventure together. We want to travel to Canada, where there is a large Syrian refugee community, to share our story and to learn from other people who have built new lives in new countries. We want to write a book together about our experience, about what integration really looks like when it works well, about how love can flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. We want to continue advocating for refugee rights and for marriage equality and for the idea that families come in all different forms. But mostly, we want to keep building this life together, one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one shared dream at a time. We want to grow old together, to face whatever challenges come our way as a team, to create something beautiful and lasting out of the love we have found. And maybe, if we are very lucky, our story will continue to inspire other people to believe in the possibility of love, to believe in the power of human connection to transcend borders and differences, to believe that everyone deserves the chance to find home, not just in a place but in another person's heart. For now, though, the pancakes are ready, and my husband is calling me to breakfast. and this ordinary Sunday morning in Stockholm feels like the most extraordinary gift I could ever have received. This is what happiness looks like. Not just the dramatic moments of romance and crisis, but the quiet daily choice to love and be loved, to build something together that is greater than the sum of its parts.